Yes, thank you, Duncan, and ladies and gentlemen, and the honorable judges of the superior courts. When you're advising a foreign client looking to make investments here, they don't have an appreciation of the culture that exists within the country and the things that they need to be aware of. Many clients that I've dealt with are very contract focused. If they feel that if the counterparty has agreed to a particular provision, that is the end of the matter and that is it. But it is often difficult to convey to them that it may be written in your contracts that you're going to get this money, but tomorrow when you're trying to get this money out, you might face difficulty because of the foreign exchange environment. Or today, the government may be offering you certain incentives. However, these incentives may be of a politically sensitive nature, and 5 years from now, they may become a major source of a crisis as to why your project comes into the public eye. And they have a bit of trouble understanding that how to deal with these issues and how to even engage with the government. Because often what I see from the federal government and the provincial governments as well is that it is a very short-sighted approach. They don't engage in the discussions about the disputes that they might have 5 years from now or 10 years from now. They're only engaged in pushing things through and being able to get that news article out that, we are bringing in $300 million in the next 1 year. Not whether they're going to be able to secure the return of that or what benefit or controversy that might come into later on. And this is an aspect that foreign investors must learn to address if they want to do business in Pakistan, if they want to do business that is less controversial and dispute-free. They must have this additional dimension to their approach. When the FATF crisis was happening and we were trying to get out of the grey list, I was part of a couple of conferences, discussions, roundtables about what can be done. And there were stakeholders present from various government institutions and various private organizations. But the approach and culture problem still seem to persist in that the focus of all the discussions seem to be about how to get out of the list rather than what do we need to do to ensure that we have robust mechanisms to counter money laundering and financing of things we don't want financed. It was just a matter of getting out of this list, meeting this criteria, passing this law, not about the future. Again, that short-sightedness that we really need to address. I don't know if I'm going to be proud of what I'm about to say. One of the things that unfortunately as a practitioner in Pakistan that you have to do when you're advising a client is try and figure out some way to get an injunction. We don't know what that's going to be, but it has to be something that will hurt the other side in some way or the other and force them to the negotiating table. Because you cannot rely on the final relief or the threat of final relief being enough of a motivator to bring parties to the negotiating table. And oftentimes to do that, you have to try and argue for injunctions against bank guarantees, against payments, against cash against documents, against things that in rest of the world are certainties. And it is unfortunate, but that is the only way you find that that's the only way to bring someone to the table. This is a very interesting question because Pakistan's stance seems to have radically shifted over the last few decades. From being a pioneer of the bilateral investment treaty, being the first country to execute a bilateral investment treaty in the 50s, we, in the aftermath of the RICO-DIC arbitration, became incredibly fearful of possible actions by foreign investors. They stopped ratifying treaties. I think there's 16 or so treaties that are still awaiting ratification. And there's talk about renegotiating treaties and terminating treaties, though we haven't done that. But there is fear that we might have another RICO deal. But and it's not a solution, because the kind of protections that you have in a bilateral investment treaty, while not to the extent of what you have in a treaty, you do already recognize to a great extent in your local law, whether that is the 1974 Investment Promotion and Protection Act, or you have the 1992 Economic Reforms Act, which protects against expropriation. You have a lot of these measures already in terms of non-discriminatory treatment, in terms of bringing yourself on parity with local investors. But the BIT has unfairly, I think, become a target. But the BIT is not the problem. The problem, which people don't want to address because it requires a much more long-term solution, is to understand why RICO DIC happened in the first place. There was an issue with the terms as well, as to how fair people thought they were, but there was also a sort of approach that once we defaulted on that, and there was a claim from Tetian, the first approach in response to that claim was to fight it. I recall that at one or two occasions early on, there was some avenue for negotiating an outcome there. But the government, perhaps again with its short-sightedness, decided it's time to put the fists up, fight this, and leave the issue for the next government to take care of. And so at every stage, from challenging the arbitration, from challenging the quantification, from challenging the costs, at every stage the country continued to throw resources at fighting something out which they could have right at the beginning recognized as partly being responsible for, and coming to a mediated, negotiated, settled outcome which would have saved the country years of pain, and now a settlement which was pretty much obtained on gunpoint. That is, I agree with all of that. We must also understand the issues why that has resulted. When Pakistan decided to liberalize its foreign investment regime, and except for just few limited sectors allowed investment into everything, we were opening the economy up, and that's a great step. But when it came to what projects the government looked at and worked on in terms of bringing investment in, initially there was a bit of a drive towards manufacturing and revenue generating sectors, but the equilibrium seemed to settle on projects that were cost centers, bringing in money and projects to set up things like power plants that cost money to continue operating. So very important indeed, but if you don't back that up with investment into increasing production capacity, you will never actually pump up your exports and foreign exchange earnings to be able to pay off those debts. And so while we opened everything up, there wasn't any proper guiding hand ensuring that the right sectors were being focused on from a long-term perspective.